Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here at this workshop, Addiction in the Workplace, Out of the Shadows. My name is Christophe Sarvin. I am one of the director of iCAAD, the International Conference on Addiction and Associated Disorders. We run conferences around addiction and behavioral mental health all over Europe and in England in May. I'm also a clinician, a therapist, and I specialize in addiction, trauma, and attachment disorders. I also had the privilege to work under your authority, Neil, for years and years now. My accent is French. I'm from Switzerland. And in a previous life, I was a senior partner in one of the largest private equity investment organization over there on the continent. And I shifted my life good 10 years ago now. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you, Neil, Dr. Neil Brenner. Neil is a consultant psychiatrist, and he has a private practice in Harley Street, which is not a surprise, but most interestingly also has been working for years and years in the heart of the city, together with Wood Lane Medical Group and a private practice at Canary Wharf, and also with the Priory Hospital Group. Neil, you're an expert in addiction, anxiety disorders, depression. You have specialized into treating addiction and coexisting disorders. We'll come to that probably at some point. You appear in many news talks, different places, speaking around the world. We've been having nice experience together every now and then, giving presentation on addiction. Now, we had a conversation before, and we really want to make that as interactive as possible. So instead of having a kind of scientific talk about addiction and overwhelm all of us with that, we're going to throw some basic ideas, but very quickly we would like you really to interact and ask questions, because all this workshop is about trying to help you to understand better and to meet your needs and your demand and interrogations. So that's very important. So we'll probably keep it quick in our conversation and hand it over to you very quickly. So with that, I've Googled addiction many times, and I usually have 150 million hits. Addiction is a very broad terminology or concept, and everyone comes with ideas about all that. Probably 75% of the hits are associated with layman's understanding, moral judgment, very, very basic ideas and opinions about all that. And only 25% is about science. And actually, it's a scientific concept as well. So let's try to make that understandable. When we say addiction, do we speak of excessive behaviors? Do we speak of substance intoxication? Do we speak of dependence? Or do we speak of a more profound mental health issue? What are the differences? Just to narrow down a little bit the debate, Neil.
Okay, so let's get rid of some of the terminology. A lot of people talk about addiction as being a one subject, covering everything, but addiction isn't that. It's a much bigger subject. We all think about addiction when we think about drugs and alcohol, but actually addiction's much bigger than that. And let me explain why. Addiction is the use of a substance, alcohol, or behavior to change the way we feel. So there are a lot of people that will use a bit of alcohol, a little bit of drugs, and not be chemically dependent on it, or as we would call addicted, but it's causing a problem in their life. So I would like you to get away from thinking about chemical addiction purely as dependency, i.e. I can't give up the substance, or I need more and more to get the same effect. Rather moving away to, is what their behavior or their chemicals are causing a problem in their lives. That gets around that old problem that you have. You calling me an addict? I'm not an addict. Okay? The man who drinks 2 glasses of wine and goes home and beats his wife up has got a drink problem because it's affecting his life. Now, the causes for this behavior can be manifest in many different ways. So it's really important not to think that there's just one reason why someone drinks too much, uses drugs, or acts out in certain behaviours. So when we think about addiction, it's important to move away from just chemicals and alcohol, but also think about what we call the behavioural addictions. Now, some of you in your workplace might have come across one or two people like this. You used to call them workaholics, people who over-exercise. Some sorts of eating disorders can be a way of controlling how you feel. Addiction is a disorder of disconnection. It isolates you, takes you away. Even though in a crowd, it takes you away from people. So the important thing is not to start getting involved in, am I an addict or am I not an addict? Is my behaviour causing a problem? Make your life easier.
Thank you, Neil. So this leads to understand what's the connection between what you said and how this works into our working environment, into the workplace. I'm working with a lot of people coming from very strong workplace cultures, be it the city, be it TfL, builders. I always see that those workplaces are full of behaviors that are absolutely ritual, culturalized. And we got a very hyperactive culture with high achievement, huge preoccupation with lifestyle, money, all that, coming to a kind of extreme hyper mode. And we see people here trying to compensate their life, trying to regulate all that, trying to overwork and get some rest, having happy hours, having to come down by drinking excessively, or trying to get a high from gambling, or different thing like that. So how does the workplace interact with addiction as a cause and effect?
I think, again, when thinking about addiction, it's no good just thinking about the individual and taking them as a complete entity, and that's the problem. They're the issue, and the only effect that they're having is on themselves. People are, when you're assessing someone for an addiction, you have to look at the physical and psychological effects that their behaviours are having on themselves, but it's much wider than that. If any of you've met an addict, and the damage it causes to people nearest them, families, can be quite profound. Then it also has a lot of damage within the workplace. People not turning up, poor performance, having certain days of the week off, Mondays they never quite make it on time type stuff. And other forms of addiction, like you can never get them to go home. They overwork, so they're exhausted, their performance falls off. And then what I call society, the effects that the addict has on society, drink driving. The number, for example, of people who drink too much one night and then the next morning, still under the influence of alcohol, drive their children to school. It's terrifying. And sometimes one of my best interventions can be in the magistrates' courts, where someone's up on their third drink driving offence, look like they're going to prison, and it's now time to really focus in on their drinking behaviour and trying to get them to see it. Because this might come to a point, forgive me if we're going off piece here, is what kills an addict? Anyone in the audience got a view? Liver disease? What kills an addict?
Behaviour from the addiction?
Yeah, could be. Well, what bit of behaviour? You're right. Denial. Absolutely. What kills an addict is denial. And you're never going to treat any form of addiction, of it, however it comes across, unless you tackle the denial. As I always say, denial is not a river in Egypt. Yeah? It's what kills you. Because until you can crack that, there's no therapy. And that's where the workplace often can be extremely helpful in treatment and recognition, is about that denial. Smashing it. We'll come to that, so maybe we'll talk about that later if you wish.
Well, that's actually leading to my second point that you tapped into. Private life and life at work. And when I hear you explaining what's happening around the denial, a lot of addictive behaviors are engaged in private life, sometimes at work, but they manifest as a lack of productivity, absenteeism, presenteeism. They manifest, or they're detectable more often in the workplace. And this is what creates one of the problems, is that someone with addiction is going to probably behave addictively or choose some addictive behavior outside from the working hours. But where do we see that usually? At work, as in people are not productive, something is going wrong. Because we're spending 8 hours at work today, every day, right? So this is the favorite place to detect a lot of things.
Okay. An addict is an addict. They will use their addictive behaviours in whatever environment they're in. That includes home and work. It can't separate the two. It might manifest itself in different environments in different ways. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that people who have finished work go and have a drink with some colleagues and that's it, and go home and that's the end of it. That's great, there's nothing wrong with that. But we see the number of people who have a drink with their colleagues and then keep going, and keep going, and keep going. And the whole thing, the colleagues have all gone home, but they're still in the pub. Or the problems develop further. And they take those problems home, or they bring the problems from home into the workplace. You cannot separate the two. An individual cannot just be a work person or a home person. So their behaviours can be mirrored in both environments, such as being unreliable at work, being unreliable at home, being depressed and anxious at home and depressed and anxious at work, failing to meet the requirements of the workplace and meet the requirements of home. So you cannot separate the two. And therefore, again, when it comes to an assessment, you have to look at the whole picture.
Thank you, Neil. So we're going to another element here, which is a lot of people telling me in my consulting room, yeah, I'm having half a bottle of whiskey at night, but I'm not drinking at the office. Yes, I had 2 grams of Coke over the weekend, but I'm not having Coke on Monday morning at the bank. In this struggle to understand that it's not because you stop using, as in engaging into the behaving of absorbing a toxic substance, that the effects are gone. And that's something very important. For 3 to 5 days, cocaine stays in the system. Yeah. It impacts the way we react, we make decisions, we arbitrate transaction or trading. And there's something here that is very often misunderstood, is that it's not because we are not absorbing a substance that we're not still under the effect of the substance.
Absolutely. As I just mentioned, the person who drinks too much then drives the car next day with the children in it, or comes to work, is not functioning as well, has a hangover, is not working as well. And if anyone knows anything about cocaine, is it might cause you that high when you take it, but then there's a reciprocal decline in the few days after it. The whole thing about cocaine, the wonderful thing, people say, oh, I only use it weekends, or I would never use during the week. The cocaine cycle is about 9 days. And therefore, from the using, the come down, the cravings return. And that takes roughly about 9 days. So it's coming up to your weekend of using behaviour. So the idea that someone can only be addicted if they're using every day, of course, is rubbish. And the damage that the drug causes, or the alcohol, or the behaviour, can be much more long-lasting than that. So don't believe, just because a person says to you, well, I would never dream of using in the working hours, I'm actually unaffected by it. That's not true. Cannabis, how long does cannabis last in the system? Anyone want to guess? 1 joint?
I think it's nearly 3 months.
No, not quite that. That would be really great. About 3 weeks. About 3 weeks. So it's still in your system. So you use only at weekends, it's still going to be hanging around for a long time to come. Now, there's a lot of controversy of how much effect on the brain that has, but we can talk about that if you wish. But the point is that these things don't go away. Okay? And one of the classical ones we see in the city is people drink too much, use a bit of cocaine, and the next day they are considerably worse. As the alcohol comes down out of the system, the depression and panic attacks shoot off if they're prone to them. And so one of the commonest things when I see a person presenting with panic attacks, I want to find out, have they been drinking too much or using? of them. Yeah? Because that sometimes is the cause. Not always, but sometimes is the cause. Yeah? So the effects of it can be long-lasting, and particularly with certain drugs, you can deplete your brain chemistry and can lead to quite bad depressions and such like for quite long periods of time. So don't believe this is all harmless. I only use it weekends.
I'd like to add something about the use on weekend, because I'm coming from abroad and I see a lot of different ways of addictive behaviors across Europe. There's something very peculiar about the UK culture is the binge culture. This is something that we don't see in Germany, France, Italy, Spain that much. It's coming, but not that much. Is this idea that we deserve a happy hour, a time out. The binge culture has started in the second half of the Victorian period as a way to numb out very long hours in the working class, and then it came into the city. It's a very specific trait of English culture to go and binge. And it is to some extent normalized because it's part of the culture, but it's also damaging more the brain because there's the kind of on and off that the brain has to permanently adapt with the substance, without the substance, the hangover, the calm down that you described. But that's something I discover all the time proper to the English culture. So nothing wrong, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to have a row there, but it's something that is to be taken into account when it comes to addiction. There is a propensity to go on a weekend basis or evening basis.
So certainly that is the case here. I hardly think French need to tell us about drinking culture because the French have the highest cirrhosis rate.
Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
highest cirrhosis rate.
That's on a permanent basis.
Because it's permanently drinking all the time. There are cultural influences on behaviour. And cultural influences not just about the whole of the UK, but cultural within the city, and maybe even certain organisations within the city. I know of, not quite in the city, but just off the city, where, on Friday afternoons, the whole place stops because they all go down to the pub. Or it's actually not the pub, it's the bar in the building. And the culture is of that, and that's how they do it. And they've been doing it for years. It's not the right culture, but it's what that firm does.
So this leads me to another important element. Addiction comes into packages of addictions. People cross-addict, use different mechanisms, and it's very rare to see just someone being addicted to one substance or behavior. We've got the famous triangle of psychostimulant, cocaine, alcohol, and sex. We've got the gambling and the work. We've got different markers there. And it's important to understand that it's not about what we're addicted to, but try to understand what's the package.
Many people come in to see me and say, I came in with one addiction and now I've gone out with 10. And that's actually true. I think they're correct. Very rare do I meet a person who says, and it comes up, and they have one addictive process. And if you go back to what I said before, it's not just about the substance it's about the whole package of behaviours that are involved. The person who feels they work extremely hard, therefore can go out and get drunk, have inappropriate relationships, cocaine and such like. And, when considering addiction, we talk about the chemical addictions, but we also mustn't ignore what are called the cross addictions, the behavioural addictions. And those, some of the worst I see in the city: eating disorders, overworking, over-exercising, which often has tremendous knock-on effects to people. And when you come to treat the person, if you don't treat the whole thing, it goes wrong. The way I explain it is addiction is like a giant umbrella. And there are a lot of segments in the umbrella: drugs, alcohol, food, gambling, shopping, work, whatever. And if you treat one segment, the person just moves around to another segment and to a different segment. So you have to treat the whole umbrella. And that's when it becomes, much more interesting, much more combative and challenging, I think would be the word.
So amongst that, I have a specific question for you, Neil. One of the favorite drug of choice in the Western world are prescription drugs.
Yeah.
and it's the elephant in the room. We think immediately of alcohol and illegal substances, but actually abuse of prescription drugs kill as much as cocaine in this country today.
Okay, that's a really good question. What's the most important drug of abuse in this country? Don't rush. Painkillers? Paracetamol? Actually, it's none of them. It's alcohol. Okay? All the drug problems, cocaine, prescription drugs, fail into insignificance compared to alcohol. But we are now seeing a change. Alcohol is still the biggest one, and particularly young women increasing dramatically alcohol-related problems. It's partly because women metabolize, I'm sorry, there's not a sexist comment, it's a chemical comment. Women metabolize alcohol slightly differently to men, and therefore their livers are more susceptible to damage. Okay, quicker and easier and younger. All right, it's just a biological fact. But we're now seeing a change, and this change is really important. And you might have followed the problem in the States, the opiate. 120 people are dying a day in the United States from an opium epidemic of this extremely strong opiate painkiller called, like heroin, but stronger than heroin, called fentanyl. Okay? And it's killing people in droves in the States. It's a national emergency which only partly being addressed. So in this country, we haven't quite got that. But we are seeing a rise in prescription drugs that are abused and drugs bought on the internet. I had a patient who just came back from Hong Kong with 1,000 Xanax tablets, which are like Valium. 1,000. That'll kill, half, a quarter of that will kill a whole floor in a trading department. It's absolutely incredible what's coming out. Now, of course, we don't know that whether these drugs actually contain anything that's really dangerous. They're manufactured in China and such like. But it's, without doubt, a much bigger problem that's coming through. And you've probably heard of the legal highs, which are no longer legal, they're illegal, things like spice and such like, which are causing a whole load of problems. So the nature of drugs that people are taking always shifting. There's always something going on. And there are kids now around the world on their kitchen table designing new drugs. If you think Breaking Bad was something, it's going on all the time in different ways. Yeah? So the point is, drugs are changing, but addicts aren't. An addict is an addict is an addict, but they will use maybe different substances. And that relates to challenges for me to how to get them off the substances and treat them. So things are changing.
Thank you, Neil. So let's go back into, with this global definition and vision of addiction, let's go back into workplace. Can I ask you, who in the room has been facing in the workplace a situation where a colleague was struggling with addiction? Can we raise our hand, please?
Okay. So a number of you have seen people and have recognized people. The rest of you have probably seen people but don't actually know that you've seen them. That's the problem. Now, I remember doing a talk like this a few years ago where someone, I asked the question, and I regret asking it, to HR departments, what is your drug policy? Okay? And someone put up their hand and said, don't. And that was their entire drug policy of the entire company, was don't. And that was it. Now, the world's moved on. You couldn't get away with that. You couldn't get away with that anymore.